Well, people often think that Dad wrote at the shack, but the shack was a place of action. And he always brought his white writing material with us, just as we kids always brought our school books, but we never opened them. There was always too much to do. So Dad actually did his writing on Monday morning. He would be at the office before dawn, and before the secretary got there was when he did his writing. Although while we were with him at the shack, we were always aware of the fact that there were ideas and thoughts going through his mind, so that I think he had a lot of his ideas in mind before he actually sat down with pencil and paper. In fact, you know, we were very careful not to interrupt his thinking. We'd be taking a walk with Dad, and it was usually a very quiet affair because you could feel that he was doing a lot of thinking. And if we had something worthwhile to say, we would say it, but in general, it was rather a quiet affair. I believe that the shack is a kind of metaphor for his philosophy of life. I think he felt that there was a lot of beauty and a lot of pleasure in living simply. And I think the shack is an expression of this. And as I think about it today, if we had had a 5-bathroom palace on that little place, we would have missed the whole philosophy of this. At the shack, there was a lot of camaraderie and togetherness and singing together and working together. To me, this is a metaphor of his hope for humanity. We don't need all the gadgets that we can produce. We can live comfortably with the minimum.
The shack is home. The shack is a monument to Aldo Leopold. It's a monument to the land ethic. It's but on a more personal level, it's a family tie that I would find it transformed the lives of, obviously, of all the 5 children. You hesitate to use the word children, let's say offspring. It was a major family effort and a major family effect that we had with pursuing this project. And it's really interesting to think that in the most important experiment that Aldo Leopold had in his professional life, that this experiment of restoration employed in a very real way his family, his wife, his relatives, his children, and we were carrying out something that was a landmark experiment in his professional life too. That's very unusual. It's very hard to find other cases where a whole family is brought together to work on a say a biological experiment.
I was fortunate to be able to observe a prairie fire started by a lightning strike. This was in central Texas, south of Dallas. Early on in my career in Prairie, and I and my major professor, Roger Landers, were coming up from College Station, and a lightning storm was approaching, and ahead of us, about a mile, there was a lightning strike. And when we got there a minute later, the fire was about 50 feet in diameter, just beside the road. We jumped out, both of us with our cameras clicking, and my last picture shows the fire about 100 feet across, and there were large splats of rain on the road, and so I expect that he may have been extinguished. We just got in the car and drove off. Any prairie fire deserves any help that it can get. So that was kind of a 1 in a million shot.
I think that a lot of people approach prairie management as a manipulator, as the grand manipulator. We go to prairies and we're going to fix it. And we've been so separated from that history. I have no memory of when there were prairies. My grandfather, who took me to Kelso Prairie, remembered there being more prairie. His parents settled on a prairie landscape. By the time my grandfather was there, he could still remember prairie chickens. By the time my mother was having her own children, there were no more prairie chickens. And there was just this constant loss of pieces. And so we don't have a very good context for prairie. However, even those people who are land managers and really seeking to do the best thing, I think, as I say, think in terms of manipulation. We're going to burn that prairie this year, and then we can argue about whether we're hurting the invertebrates or if, you know, all kinds of aspects, pros and cons, and then we think about all the little pieces. And there's there have been some people who have been introducing some thoughts to me about Native American context, and I've been thinking about it myself. And one of the things that I think Native Americans were certainly manipulators. They manipulated the landscape, but they did it from within. And we tend to do it from without. We stand outside this dimensional thing and we try to create an effect. I think probably the healthiest way for us to be good managers would be for us to take the knowledge and information that we have and in some real way put ourselves within the ecosystem and then think about what sorts of things we would want to do to make it a healthy system. I think that Native Americans burned the landscape frequently. They did it for a lot of different reasons. And this is the thing that I first started thinking about in terms of massive changes to the landscape that Native Americans could do. And that was a really kind of a big idea for me at first. And then now I think there were probably an awful lot of subtle things that seem more subtle, that in terms of the Native people's interaction with the landscape. For example, eating certain kinds of roots. That it may be that yanking plants out of the ground in a particular way, that may seem kind of coarse and rough to us, was a way of sustaining a population that might not persist for very long, except for there was a relationship to this organism in the prairie which happened to be people. And so it may be that we're losing a part of the character of prairie because we don't interact on it on a personal level as managers of prairie. That maybe we should be experimenting with ways of using rattlesnake master leaves for shoes. One of our volunteers came up to me and brought an article from just a little one-page article from National Geographic that indicated that Native peoples had been making shoes from rattlesnake master for 5,000 years. It must work if they're making it for 5,000 years. And I don't know what time they were cut and taken, but the point is that there were uses for a lot of different things. And just those uses may have created a whole different kind of health than what we have now. If you pull a rhizomatous root out of the ground, it stimulates a kind of growth that's very different than if you're very careful and don't let anybody touch it. I'm not saying we should all go out and start pulling plants out of the ground at all, but I'm suggesting that we may be on the verge of another way of thinking about management in terms of bringing people onto the landscape, in terms of what we've lost. In that context, and in terms of how we can begin to reinstate an involvement by people in a healthy way. I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of danger, too.
Well, I grew up in southern Iowa in a small town. My grandfather was a farmer, and my uncle was a farmer. So I guess my first memories of the prairie, I guess I would describe it, because it wasn't a tallgrass prairie, it was a farm, is just the wide expanse of it. As I got a little bit older, I used to like to go out, particularly when there was a tornado front moving in, much to the chagrin of my mom, and lie out on a field and watch the storm front move in, the way that the colors would change and the air would go still, and then that great rush of wind that would come down. But it was mainly the sense of expansion, of just full-lung, open space that became just part of my being, I guess, part of who I am and part of what I was used to, and part of what I have to get at least once or twice a year now, or I'll die of claustrophobia. I live in New England, so I don't get much of that anymore, but at least twice a year I try to get a little bit of it. I once interviewed a farmer in northeastern Nebraska who was one of the last settlement waves was in that particular corner of the country. He was about 98 years old, I think, when I interviewed him in the 1980s. And he talked about as a boy coming into that part of Nebraska. And the thing that he, just wouldn't shut up about was the big blue stem, of just what a marvelous grass it was and how tall it was, how beautiful it was when the wind rippled through the hills there, of just how productive it was too. And of course it was gone by the time that that I was sitting there in his living room talking about it. But it tells you something, that in this old man's memory, one of the things that stood out the most was coming into that part of a place where he'd lived all his life by that point. And what I remembered most was the smell and the sight and the feel and the whole experience of a great expanse of majestic blue stem waving in the wind. It was something. And I've never been envious of being 98, but I was envious of that man at that time, of having that experience. As I got older and I started doing books and started traveling more, and I'd been living in New England for a number of years where it's more of a vertical horizon. I remember the first time I entered the sandhills of Nebraska, and first of all, it's so sparsely populated, there's no telephone poles, a lot of places no fences. And I guess as an adult it reminded me of my childhood because it was just so open, and the grass was tall and it was waves in the wind, and there was the sound of a meadowlark, and there was just something. It's really, to me, it's almost inexpressible. I make my living doing things with words, but I've come to realize there are some things that words and science and reason can't entirely express, and not everybody responds to that landscape the same way. My wife is from New England, and when she gets there, she gets sort of overwhelmed and almost frightened by it. She's not drawn to it. But for me, it's as if it's a transcendental experience for me when I get out onto the open plains, and it just does something to my soul that I really can't totally express.
I really feel that we belong here as Iowa people. It was our homeland for a long time before contact with the Europeans. And some of the stories that I've been told makes me feel close to the land. And at the time that we held this country, we were like Switzerland. We were a neutral country, and all the other tribes recognized that this was our territory. And I think that as long as we kept that connection with the Creator, that we could have stayed here. I'm reminded of one story about the Comanches when they come to raid for slaves, as they did all over the country. They came into Iowa territory, and they came on a village where there was all the warriors were mostly gone, a few old men, and this one old man saddled his horse and went out to meet the Comanches. And as they come up over the hill, they seen this old man riding, and they drew their bows. And he got off on his horse and turned his back to him. And he sat down on our grandmother Earth, and he began to sing a song. Hawe jare wakanda e tawe, hawe jare wakanda e tawe, oh hey. And the words to that song say, this is God's day. And they started to shoot at him, and the arrows would miss him. They would go above him or to each side, and they couldn't hit him. And they realized that this old man had some connection with the Creator, something that protected him. And so they left him alone because they were afraid of the, the power of the Creator, and knew that they were doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So I truly believe that if we had kept that connection with the Creator and lived the way He wanted us to be, that our people would still be in the state of Iowa.
The Tallgrass Prairie, when we were around, like mostly the sandhills, and sometimes when we traveled even to like Nebraska, when we harvested as far as Ovid and Julesburg, Sterling, Nebraska, all the way south. We go to a lot of harvesting while my grandfather and grandmother were still alive, and we lived in tents. So the tents, there were like a village of white tents, like the cavalry. We just lived in them by the fields where we're going to work. And so there were many times that at some of the higher places where there were grazing land and not farmland, we would go over there and pick some of the medicines that were up there, but mostly some of it for food items, like the rosebud berry. And we would pick that and boil that. And later on, when I started to describe the goodness and the taste of those teas and other foods, I found out that a handful of the rosebud berries, when you boil it in a saucepan, that it was equivalent to 20 oranges. Just one glass of that is equivalent to 20 oranges in vitamin C. So I started to know then that no wonder why we ran around and never caught colds. Because we did chew that. You had to have a skill to be able to chew that without getting into the seeds, because the seeds are bushy and they're sticky inside. You don't bite into that membranous part, but the outer part is, you use your tongue to spin it around as you're peeling the fruit off the sides of the seed. So it takes a little bit of skill to do some of these things. And so those plants were very valuable to us as a power source of, later on I found out it was. Also, one of the powerful things to me, and even to this day, is smelling sage. And it's very sacred for us to take sage and make it into a ball, and to put it on a tukey or a shell, and to burn it. And the smell of it is such a smell of a powerful, peaceful smell. Later on, I found out also that the chemistry behind that incense of the sage was good for calmness. And so I started to learn things later. Well, we always did this, but never did tell it in scientific terms. They just did it. We just knew that through trial and error, these things were for peace. And we still do that all the time, never explaining or describing what's going on here scientifically. Never did we do that. Only probably me does that. I'm a storyteller, and I tell stories about the plant. plants. And some people around here probably do, but I don't hear them in a public setting. And so I share a lot with people, and it's safe for me because I got the science information from the people. And I always just tell the parts of ours, we did it in a ritualistic way. Another one that I found to be of a strong medicine for us was the sweetgrass. The sweetgrass we burnt for ceremonial purposes, and the medicine men used that to make the room smell like a distinct traditional power. If you smell it, there's a certain type of nostalgia that comes to your mind. And I always say that it's probably because it's in our DNA. We've been doing this so often and so many times that it stays in our blood. And so when you smell it, you'd say, I smelled this someplace before, but where? But it's banked inside of our own bodies that it brings that memory back to the body. I know every time my grandmother would put sage, sweetgrass, or cedar on the stove early in the morning, they would talk in small tones. And I knew I was loved, so I was contented and really at peace and sleeping in a protected way. And she would tiptoe up to the bed, and in small tones she would say, "Tchakoja wana yektahe." My grandson, are you awake now? And if I wanted to sleep some more, I would go like this. I'm not awake, okay? And so she would tiptoe away and later on come back again. "Tchakoja wana yektahe." Are you awake now? And if I wanted to get up now, I would go like this. And she would tiptoe away and start cooking. And so then later on in life, I knew that they had a lot of respect for little ones. And our word for children is same as sacred. Wakhayaja. That's our word for children.
The Iowa stories state that we have been living in the Tallgrass Prairie since time immemorial, or what we call Madadanida, since the time when animals and humans could talk together, since the time when the clans came together as animals and slowly became human beings. All across, centered in Iowa, appropriately enough, but extending up into southern Minnesota, northern Missouri, and into a little bit of Illinois and into the western trough of the Missouri River. Creation began in the marsh in our stories. Jegiche is what we called the marsh. Muskrat dove to the bottom of the marsh and dug up the mud and made it into a ball and spread it out on the land. And that's how land was created. Utwake, muskrat. We also had another figure called Trickster, Ishchinki, who was the son of Pi, the sun. Trickster was kicked out of his father from heaven, and he landed somewhere in Iowa. There is a rock, we still don't know where it is, but there's a rock with Trickster's butt prints and his hand prints pressed into the rock where he landed. Trickster began to travel across the land, making animals, improving them, helping grow the land, helping the different plants. There's a rather risque story about where many of these plants came from. Anyway, so Trickster was a creator. Trickster was a transformer in partnership with many of these animals. One thing to remember too is that Jegiche, the marsh, the pothole prairie, that mud, that's the stuff of life. That's where the earth came from. That's what human beings are made out of, that earth. And in many mound burials, you can find a layer of this marsh earth put into the mound. And the mound is a symbol of rebirth. The person goes into it, painted red, has the red earth. Therefore, another life will again come out of the mound, or symbolically anyway. When I came to Iowa, I was expecting to see at least patches of the original prairie. When I came to this place and I smelled the chemicals, and I saw just a sweeping vista of farms. It felt to me the way somebody from a farmland would look at a wilderness as. To me, it was reverse wilderness. I was looking for an ancestral home, and what I saw was a blanket of monoculture and chemical infiltration such that I couldn't recognize anything from our stories. And so I set as my task to try to recover that old Iowa beneath this blanket of new Iowa. I knew it was there. Things sleep, but they don't die. So in my search, I used every venue: archaeology, linguistics, natural history, journals, whatever I could find, to try to recover, to try to reimagine the Iowa that we must have known, the Iowa that we Iowa people gave our names to. I went to the Neil Smith Refuge because I heard that there was an Iowa restoration project for the prairie there, and that buffalo were part of that project. I wanted to see some buffalo. So I drove down there, and I couldn't find them. I couldn't believe how such big animals could hide in an apparent rolling and open terrain. We have an old story that when you kill a buffalo, if you cover it with the hide 4 times, in many of our stories, these buffalo will assume flesh again and stand up and live. And as I was looking at this new prairie, parts burned over and parts restored, I realized this was like a buffalo. I realized that this was a new covering for this prairie, and that someday it too would stand up and live.
You know, when I teach to undergraduates, what I tell them is it's important to separate what we know from what we guess at, or we think we know, or we can hypothesize about. We know for sure that there were native people in the region at least 9,000 years ago. And it's probable that there were native people in the Tallgrass Prairie area at least twice that long ago, and possible that there were even tens of thousands of years before that people in the area. But when we look at things like the Bering Strait theory even, or other anthropological guesswork, all we can say is we found, we have the Clovis site in New Mexico, we have Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, we have a few places where we have clear, conclusive evidence of human existence, and we know people were there then. They were probably there, at least 1,000 years before that happened, just in terms of migration and so forth to get to those areas. But we don't know how much longer before that people definitely were there. It requires guesswork and so forth, and anthropologists, archaeologists are fighting tooth and nail about everything from archaeological data to linguistic data to some of the genetic testing they've been doing, and it's really all up in the air at this point in time. Who knows, tomorrow we could find some archaeological site which will say, 200,000 years ago and everyone migrated out of the Americas to the rest of the world. We just don't know. Even for more classical woodlands, Ojibwe groups, for example, around Leech Lake in the northern half of Minnesota, would actually take long trips to the prairie region for the express purpose of hunting buffalo and elk and so forth. Even though, especially after Americans enter the picture, typically the history of native tribes moving westward in the region is painted as pressure from Europeans pushing people westward. It's really not true. The power and potential of the prairie region pulled people westward far more than they were pushed. And this explains why there had been a pattern of westward movement for thousands of years before Europeans came. There was simply buffalo hunting, elk, and so forth, were such an efficient way to feed large groups of people. as well as, in the southern reaches of the prairie, especially farming and so forth. These things were powerful, and they compelled large numbers of people to move westward. I'm reminded of a story that a gentleman from Red Lake was telling me about an Indian guy walking out into the prairie and hunting, and he ran into the white man, the first white man he'd ever seen. And of all the strange things to happen, he had to blow his nose. So he sort of stuck a finger in one nostril and blew the snot out, and then did the same thing on the other side. And the white man had to blow his nose at the same time and took out a handkerchief and blew his nose and put it in his pocket. And the Indian was thinking, wow, the white man keeps everything. I was always amused by his his rendition of different ideas. But on a more serious note, Native people, when they saw Europeans coming, initially I suppose they were quite curious and interested in trade, in acquiring the good things that Europeans did have to offer, but at the same time, I think very scared. They'd heard stories and had seen evidence of the things that came with contact with Europeans. As much as the violence, the warfare, and things like this would be significant, the single most devastating thing in contact between Europeans and Native people were the introduction of new diseases. And they had ravaged communities that had never seen a white man long before white people had ever showed up. Sometimes mortality rates as high as 90%. Some communities as high as 100%. And this had just devastated communities throughout the Tallgrass Prairie region, throughout all of North America. It was the demise of the Aztec Empire. It was the demise of many large and populous communities, whether it was De Soto's expedition or any other significant early contact that introduced diseases. They ravaged Native communities. Smallpox, probably the most significant, but even childhood diseases, measles and things like that could wipe out thousands and thousands of people. So before Europeans even showed up, Native people had fear. Was there going to be a new wave of disease? Were these people going to be able to trade with us? Were we going to be able to get what we wanted from them? Or were they coming to take, and to take everything we had? So I think there was quite a bit of legitimate fear as well as excitement about the possibilities, opportunities that might be there as well. After making contact, Europeans would sort of prove time and time again their willingness to take the land at the expense of Native people, and oftentimes offer very little, if anything, in terms of payment. The initial interactions, official interactions, government-to-government interactions between Europeans and Native American people involve so-called peace and friendship treaties, in which the U.S. government in particular was interested in drawing nice, neat little lines around each tribe and their exclusive land holdings, as opposed to the exclusive land holdings of other tribes, so they could sort of divide and conquer one treaty at a time or one military expedition at a time, the entire Tallgrass Prairie region. And initially, Native people would sign these treaties saying, oh, we agree to be at peace with you, we agree to be your friends, to have cordial and friendly trade relations and so forth, and to get along. We agree that these are our land holdings, and there were no land cessions. But shortly thereafter, treaty commissioners would come out again and begin to talk about how can we acquire some of your exclusive land holdings. And this whole process was fraught with problems of communication, of different concepts of everything from land ownership to its transfer and how land would be used. And the U.S. government was very interested in acquiring land as quickly as possible. There was this idea of manifest destiny, of any American can be anything he wants and acquire, land and be farmers and unlimited opportunity, that it's actually the destiny of the United States to expand from sea to shining sea, and woe betide anyone or anything that stands in its way. This is the process. Sometimes there were people who would sort of mourn the plight of the poor red savages that would have to be sacrificed in this process, but there was no way to avoid the sacrifice. It was sort of the idea behind Manifest Destiny, that America was going to expand, that the Tallgrass Prairie and everything else in between the two oceans would be the United States, and nothing could stop it. Even if it wanted to, even if, God forbid, it would be right to stop or structure the process in some different or better way. It's so ironic, the whole idea of discovery, it just seems ridiculous from a Native perspective. You have, everything from Schoolcraft discovering the source of the Mississippi River. He tried everywhere. He actually named a different river, the Schoolcraft River, thinking it was the Mississippi, until he finally asked an Indian. He said, well, here's where it is. Showed him right where it was. Or if it was, Perry in finding the North Pole, or Lewis and Clark charting their path westward to open all of the Americas, the Western Americas, for white settlement, exploration, expansion, to open Manifest Destiny for that huge chunk of North America. The whole idea just seems preposterous. Columbus didn't discover America, Indians were here. And the whole idea of Lewis and Clark as discoverers really is a misnomer as well. They were guided by many, not just one, but many different Native people. It wasn't just Sacagawea either. Many different Native people on their chart. And there's no way they could have found it without Native people. So Lewis and Clark from the start, the idea of them as discoverers is, a misnomer. Even though they clearly did open a new chapter in American history. Americans didn't have any idea how far the Pacific Ocean was, much less how they could go about claiming it as their own, until Lewis and Clark opened that door. So certainly they did something for the United States. It was a significant, pivotal moment in U.S. history. For Native people, it opened the door to a series of coercions, of military expeditions, to whole new waves of disease, and to the loss of most of their beloved land possessions, sacred sites, and to large-scale loss of life, to the loss of their entire way of living. The days of being entirely self-sufficient would disappear easily within several decades. There are a couple of things that are of notable interest. Now, I'm not familiar with a large-scale effort at returning the landscape to the original Tallgrass Prairie, but I am aware of a couple of Native groups that are interested in and have created a seed bank of indigenous varieties of corn and other crops that were farmed in the Tallgrass Prairie region, and are preserving those. A lot of, like the modern day corn, that doesn't reproduce itself. All this hybrid stuff. And some people are interested in that just for the sake of, what if the apocalypse happens tomorrow? But Native people are interested in maintaining or preserving, or at least preserving the opportunities to have lifeways and the very things that they had when the Tallgrass Prairie was all native land. So the seed bank is one thing that's going on, but I think even more essential are the recent efforts at cultural revitalization, language revitalization, and you see these throughout the Native communities in the Tallgrass Prairie region and beyond, where there's a resurgence in Native communities, an interest in returning to traditional lifeways. That doesn't mean necessarily going back to living in wigwams, but reconnecting with the language, the culture, the ceremonies, the things that dominated life in the Tallgrass Prairie region. And the interest in those things is there, and it's growing. And the language revitalization efforts in particular, I think, are really interesting and moving to see, and I think hold a lot of potential and promise. As devastated as many of the Native communities were through the loss of life, loss of land, war on culture, as devastating as those things were, I think the Native communities really are healing and looking at return of land through outright acquisition, through legal means, through maybe reopening a treaty process with the U.S. government, through all of these things as one of the essential components to doing that. At the same time, looking at revitalizing culture, language, and maintaining in not just memory, but in action, the importance of the Tallgrass Prairie to Native people.
My view of the land, like a lot of farmers, it's certainly a resource. And like a lot of farmers, it's a resource that we need to use wisely. And I believe in the last years that I've grown in my appreciation of protecting that resource. Certainly I can go back in my early farming days and I can see where the moldboard plow turned everything over and it was black. And we took many, many hours to produce a bushel of corn. Today we don't turn it over and make it black. I'm very conscious of conserving the resource. I'm not saying preserve it and do nothing to it, but the wise use of it. And so we try to farm in a manner, and the people that I work with in protecting that resource and not overusing it. When you look at a timeline of how long it took the thousands of years to lay down this land, it was a great length of time. And if you put in that timeline the width of the time that I farmed it and my father farmed it, my grandfather and my great-grandfather, I don't know, it would probably be a sliver you could hardly see. And so we're occupants here of this land for a very short time, and we can have a tremendous impact. And I just hope that on my tombstone you look back, maybe it says he tried, and I've tried to conserve as best I can through various methods, through tillages, through terraces, through waterways, through wildlife habitat. The resource that's there, that hopefully for the next generation they'll say have the same opportunities on this resource that I have had.
Yeah, I think you have to consider what the conditions were in 1840. If I had arrived in Iowa in 1840 to stake out some land, I would probably have come here from a place where I didn't have the land, or I was trying to eke out a living on some rocky soils in northeast United States, and I wanted a chance to develop these rich black soils. So I think that I probably wouldn't have behaved any differently than the people who were there. I would have felt a need to support my family, a need to make the prairie productive, or to make the land productive, and to convert the prairie into something productive. So I think I would have done the same thing that they have done. It's a part of the mindset of the culture at the time. And it's only now, in retrospect, I have the ability to look back, or the leisure to look back and say, well, it's unfortunate that we didn't preserve some of that prairie rather than converting it all. It's interesting. I've asked my students sometimes, say, okay, you're going into a new country. It's never been farmed. It's never been converted to any type of use other than the native material that's there. And I say, okay, now what percentage of that would you, if you're enacting laws right at the beginning, what percentage would you save? And it's interesting to get their answers. Some of them feel that they should save 25% of the natural systems that are there, and some say 15%. But try as I might, I cannot get the students to go below 5% of the natural systems that are there. And yet when you look at the prairie, tallgrass prairie ecosystem, particularly when you consider Iowa, more than 99.9% of the tallgrass prairie in Iowa has been converted to agricultural purposes. And I think that was just done. I mean, I don't think anyone really thought about it. It was just to make the land productive was the primary thing. But yet we went from something that was about 28 million acres of tallgrass prairie when the Euro-American settlers arrived in 1833, and from 1833 to approximately 1900, we converted almost all of that land to agricultural productivity. So today we have less than 0.1% remaining. And one analogy that I like to use with this is, some people are interested in putting together puzzles. And I like to put together puzzles. So if you want an analogy, think of the state of Iowa as a 1,000-piece puzzle. And that's the amount of original prairie. 28 million acres represents that 1,000-piece puzzle. Today we have one of those pieces remaining, and that piece is not intact. That piece is scattered across the state. So here, if you're going to reconstruct prairie, then you somehow have to get the information from that one piece, and then you have to try to rebuild that 28 million acres or some portion of it from that one piece. And so that's quite a challenge that you face. Now, in all fairness, there are a few other pieces around that are degraded prairie, and if you want to make an analogy there, think of maybe a few other pieces, something maybe the dog got a hold of them and chewed them, or they went through the wash in the pocket of your jeans or something like that. So they're very blurred and indistinct. So you've got this one fragmented piece and these other pieces that are blurred and indistinct, and we're trying to reconstruct what our tallgrass prairie was like from those images, and it's very difficult.
In roadside management, we have a narrow focus. You know, we're just looking at the right-of-way, but our thinking is the right-of-way and beyond. It's kind of a theme that we come up with all the time because, you know, we're neighbors to everybody in the state. Every farmer lives next to a road, county road, state road. So running prairie through this extensive network of right-of-way, it's a stepping stone to bringing prairie, you know, to all parts of the state, all parts of the Midwest. You know, the roadside can take you everywhere. We already have funding available from the Iowa DOT to plant prairie vegetation on schoolyards as outdoor classrooms. Now you're introducing, you know, 7, 8-year-old kids to prairie. You get them comfortable with it. They're going to want to take it home. Someday they'll grow up thinking, hey, I want some of that neat stuff in my yard. And once you've got it in their yards, you know, and it's already showing up there, a lot of home landscaping, corporate campuses, schoolyards, roadsides, on and on. You know, we can get more and more of this, hopefully from, you know, in the near future. Every time a parking lot or a rooftop of a certain size, you know, something that seals the earth and no water can permeate there, the mitigation is going to require, you know, 50 yards of prairie down, you know, down slope from that building to slow the runoff. I just see, you know, roadside prairie vegetation management. I see roadside prairie establishment as a way of getting through, you know, all around the state and then beyond the right-of-way.
Tallgrass Prairie landscape is what I grew up with, and where I grew up in Kansas, there's a lot more of it. It was right out our back door. It was in our front yard. We had to burn our yard every year. The Flint Hills in Kansas were a place that was where we looked to as our sort of spiritual home as a family, and going through it was always a special thing. And being alone, I think, as an ecologist or as a botanist, you get the opportunity to be alone, be just by yourself, just goofing around, just walking around, looking, listening, not being engaged in any sort of mental, verbal contest with somebody else and talking, just being alone for long periods of time and hearing the wind and seeing the organisms and trying to get to know some of the critters that are out there. It's a very personal, religious experience. It's a part of my spirituality that is probably at the core. I think if I'd grown up on the tundra or in the northeastern deciduous forest, it would be the same thing. It's where you get your first discussion with God. And I know going to other places and living there for a while, they think you're crazy. They think you're crazy to enjoy the plains of Oklahoma or of Kansas, the dry, hot winds, the oppressive humidity, the places they think are flat. But that's home. That's what matters. It's what you want to defend. It's what you want your kids to see and to enjoy. And there's nothing more exciting for me than to see my daughter, who's 2.5, begin to notice these things herself. And so I think it's true for anybody, if you have had the privilege of being in contact with natural areas, natural places, semi-natural places, as a kid, you never lose it. You never lose your love for those places. And my very best students are the ones that have bonded with a particular place, whether it be a prairie or another place. They're the ones who are passionate about biology. They're the ones who love what they do and will do anything to have some kind of a career or some kind of a life that includes that. In thinking about what the future of the upper Midwest Tallgrass Prairie states could look like, I look back to an era in which we had a very prosperous agricultural community, namely the early part of the 1900s, 1910. The agricultural statistics show that there were maximum number of farmers on the land, maximum number of acres in farms in the area that I'm studying, northeast Iowa. And also that we had enormous amounts of prairie hay meadow being used. It was cut once or maybe twice a year for hay and fed to the horses or to the cows in the wintertime. This preserved a lot of our current prairie preserves. The Hayden Prairie in northeast Iowa, it was a hay meadow. And, but this was part of the agricultural economy. People made money off of this stuff. There were also huge amounts of pasture. This was probably pasture that had never been plowed. It had been grazed to the point that many of the native species were gone, but grazing methods could change. We know a lot more about how we could graze those pastures differently, both to preserve the native species and to provide more grass forage for animals. With the rotational grazing method, in some cases you get twice as much forage as you do with the continuous grazing. So I see a landscape that would look very much like 1910, but with modern updated methods. In 1910, they were rotating their crops. That provided the fertility, the nitrogen fertility. It provided the insect control through rotation of crops. It provided a lot of the weed control in combination with mechanical cultivation. We have new methods now that improve mechanical cultivation, that improve the crop rotation, that we could be managing the row crop acres with this crop rotation. Now, at that time and up through about the mid-1950s, only half of our land was in row crops. The rest of it was in the rest of the rotation, the clover, the oats, things that are really holding the soil and, by the way, providing habitat for native birds, insects, other things. So I see a landscape in which we are using our own management skills and biological processes to provide many of the services that we need to produce a crop, mainly fertility, weed and pest control. Meanwhile, large chunks of the land are in a prairie or prairie analog. They're in a sod that is holding the soil, fixing nitrogen, and keeping that rainfall right there, infiltrating water right away instead of letting it run off quickly. And intermixed with those rotational hay meadows, oats, small grains, row crops, you'd have pastures, probably fairly extensive pastures, grazed rotationally along the stream sides. Right now we have a conservation reserve program that is targeting streamside buffers for to plant perennial plants to control the runoff and to reduce the amount of nitrate that ends up in our surface waters. Why not graze that? Why not turn that into an economic opportunity in which you have basically a wide riparian buffer strips, but instead of just being buffer strips, they're grazed rotationally, and they're in natives. So we could basically interdigitate this prairie landscape back into our farms and create places to hunt, create better places to fish, create places to botanize, to teach children about nature, to get kids excited about being on the farm instead of bored because there's nothing for them to do other than stay away from the heavy machinery. We could have a place that, while is still dominated by crop production, is more attentive to our environmental needs and our human needs, the need for a pretty place to live.
Well, that's an important question. And especially when we consider that the human has been around with the big brain 150 to 200,000 years, the 1,350 cubic centimeter brain, and we've had agriculture only in the neighborhood of 8 to 10,000 years. So in the neighborhood of some 5% of our total evolutionary history with the big brain, we were gatherers and hunters, and much more a part of nature in an integrated sense than when we started agriculture. But, and it's an open question yet as to why it tended to come all at once with various parts of the world, probably beginning in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, but very quickly spreading into Asia. And then we see it over in Middle America, agriculture coming. And Jane Jacobs thinks that the city preceded agriculture. Most people think the city is a derivative of agriculture. At any rate, what it is the featuring on the part of the human in most places around the world, the annual grain crops. I've often thought if I were to write a modern version of Homo sapien, Linnaean description of Homo sapien, I would begin by saying grass seed eater primarily. Our corn, our wheat, our rice, our sorghum, our barley, all members of the grass family, a family that's about 65 million years old. Secondarily, legume seed eater. The potatoes come in there about number 3 in terms of calories and economics. So it's this dependence upon the annual grain crop primarily, which requires that we tear the ground up every year, and it's subject to the forces of wind and rain. That agricultural experience I refer to as the problem of agriculture, rather than problems in agriculture. That I think it's probably beyond our ethical stretch to do it correctly over a century. On a piece of land, somebody's going to show up somewhere and erode ecological capital below replacement levels. So that's one reason that we look to the prairie, which features the perennial grown in a mixture, in a polyculture. There have been some more resilient agricultural economies than others. Northwestern Europe, for instance, has had fairly resilient agriculture, but the rains fall light upon those hills. And also there's a long history of carrying the bottom furrow up to the top of the hill, either with oxen or draft animals, or if it's too steep, carry it up on their own back. Then, of course, there's the story of the farmers of 40 centuries. But even there, we see that the ecological capital is slipping seaward and has slipped over those 40 centuries. So this is an interesting experiment for a relative of a chimpanzee to see if we can take greater control over our food production. This is the sweat of the brow experience that is talked about in the Genesis version. And it's interesting to me, for instance, that the animals that are domesticated animals have large amounts of fat associated with them, whereas their wild relatives don't have much fat. Has there been an unwitting selection for the high fat content in order to accommodate the hard work that agriculture requires? I think it's safe to say that in a certain sense we're a fallen species. We're certainly a species out of context. And that the agricultural revolution, which featured the greatest group of revolutionaries to ever live, that gave us essentially all of our crops and livestock, that we've yet to build an agriculture as sustainable as the nature we destroy, which I think places the human in the nature of a kind of a dramatic tragedy, as understood by Alfred North Whitehead. He said the essence of dramatic tragedy lies not in unhappiness, but in the remorseless, inevitable working of things. It is, however, through people it's experienced as unhappiness. So here we are, a species that we have to eat, we have to have agriculture, and yet it undercuts the very basis of our own existence.
Prairie to me is an edge. And it's kind of a front line of a great conflict that has not only existed on this continent, but around the world. We use this word civilization, and we mean by that all of the human endeavor, but in fact that only covers a part of the human endeavor. There are people who have been grassland people, nomadic people, for a very long time, in Africa, in Central Asia, in Australia, in South America. All grassland people who lived nomadic lifestyles and didn't leave that record of civilization, and they cut their deal with a very arid environment. And the prairie to me is always an edge of conflict between those two modes of living. And it's not part of ancient history. It's part of who we are, each person is, and that conflict between freedom and independence and civilization and wilderness. And there is where we come to see who we are. I was surprised as I traveled around the country after the book, the degree to which every community almost had a prairie network of some sort of effort going on in the schools and the local prairie network gathering seeds. And they were all surprised to hear that these things were going on in other towns. It's almost like a spontaneous regeneration of the prairie through its people who'd lived there long enough to understand the instructions of their place. That's wonderful news, because it's not going to require the kind of action from government that we've come to depend on for environmental protection. We don't have to go lobby Congress that is now completely dysfunctional to take care of these things, that the prairie people and the prairie through its own forces will take care of it in the end. Part of that force is economic. The prairie is an ecosystem, but as such is an economic system. And when it doesn't make sense to treat it the way we've treated it, then things like subsidies become necessary, and those won't be supported forever. And if they aren't supported forever, then the farmers will begin to go broke. That's a sad thing on some level. But on some level, it's the prairie saying, folks, you've done this wrong. And here's how to do it right, if you'll just listen. You can inhabit this place successfully. Your children don't have to move from your small towns and go to live in the cities. They can find a future in this place. They can find rewards. And they can come to inhabit the place successfully. I really hate to see this whole argument wrapped up as an environmental debate. And I'm not shy about environmental debates. That's what I'm in most of the time. But it becomes polarized when it is. And one of the most striking things about this to me, as I wrote the book especially, was to drive through the Midwest and drive through the areas further west, more arid, and look at the ghost towns. They were everywhere. People were leaving, or there would be small towns full of old people, and that's all. Bitter old people. And this is about humanity to a huge degree. This is about having rewarding lives and decent lives in a place. And that's all related to our understanding how a place works. So this is not someone saying, let's save a few charismatic megafauna like the bison. This is about understanding the creation's instructions to its inhabitants.